We're very proud to present our first speaker, the keynote address of the event, who's a member of the ASF class of 1984, Pascal Beltrán del Río. Mr. Del Rio, for those of you, few of you who don't know, is the editorial director of Excelsior, has had a very distinguished career, which includes being a recipient of the National Journalism Award twice. He writes multiple columns, hosts TV shows, radio shows, leads a debate show, has worked for important political magazines, and covered very important political events in Mexico, the US, the Middle East, and all over the place. If it has to do with journalism, he's done it. So he will have to be kicking off our event this year because people who work at newspapers, well, you know, they work while we all sleep, first of all. We don't want to upset the population. We want everybody to have their newspaper tomorrow at 5:30 a.m. sharp. So without further ado, Mr. Del Rio, please take the stand.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I have to tell you that it's the first time I've come back to the school in 31 years. So they took me down memory lane, and it was hard to recognize the place. I think it's improved a lot. But I was fortunate to recognize my locker. Speaking of which, I'll have to talk to Mr. Williams when this ends, because I left a sandwich there in 1984 and I would like it back. The last time I walked these halls, I was wearing a trench coat. I had an earring. My hair was dyed some color, I can't remember which. And I was most certainly listening to Gary Newman on my Walkman. You guys ask your parents what a Walkman was, because my time is running. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to talk today about failure. Let me tell you that one of the most rewarding experiences life can give those who practice the profession of journalism is to be witness to the evolution of public life. This spectacle is even more fascinating in times of transition, like the ones we, who were born in the second half of the 20th century, have lived through. For me, the experience of living and chronicling the Mexican political transition was accompanied by the extraordinary technological development of the instruments used to put it on record. In both cases, it is fair to say that evolution has not been free of charge, but is rather the consequence of trial and error, failed and successful experiments, and the pursuit of improvement with results which were not always satisfying. Throughout this speech, I would like to underline the parallelism in these two fields. The one of the recent history of Mexico's political evolution compared to the technological improvements which have made our daily life easier. In various events in world history, both aspects are closely entwined. The Industrial Revolution gave Great Britain the leadership it required to be launched as a global superpower on top of Spain, even when the latter had colonized more than half of this continent. In these times, the blessings of globalization have become universal, and technological modernization has had a decisive role in various mobilizations which have recently shaken the world, such as Arab Spring. In this context, it is interesting to confirm the coincidence in time of the transformations in Mexican civic life in the 1980s and those that technology experienced during the same decade with the invention of the personal computer, as well as its affordability in popularization. This duality fulfilled in an imperceptible manner the adage proclaimed in John Lennon's 1971 song, "Give Power to the People." The power to try on screen what would later become reality. the power to transform failure into success. I wrote this speech on my computer, an instrument which surely is part of the daily life of the so-called Generation Y, those born between 1980 and 2000, and even more so of Generation Z. Sometimes it seems that this device has always been among us. During my schooling and first years on the job, I learned to use typewriters. Ask your parents what a typewriter was. Mechanical letter writing machines, which use slugs of metal with raised letters on them to make neat printed marks on paper. By the way, in one of my high school courses here at ASF, we learned how to type properly. That is, swiftly, with a straight back, without peeking, using all 10 fingers. Damn, I must have failed that course. Although I have to say that I have mastered the fastest two-finger typing you have seen. Between those machines, almost museum pieces or collectibles, and the electronic devices of today, there's a fundamental difference: the ease of discovering and correcting errors. The screen of a computer or a mobile device grants the user the opportunity to review or correct the text before printing or submitting it. My contemporaries and I weren't that lucky. We had to type as quickly as today, yet with greater caution. Otherwise, we had to retape the whole page. Funny to say it, but my generation was one with trash cans full of crumpled paper balls. That's why we invented office basketball. The machines we used were the result of several sets of innovation, in which one name is worth mentioning: American Christopher Latham Soles, who not only participated in the design of the first commercial typewriter, the 1874 Remington, but also created the distribution of the alphabet on the keyboard in order to produce a faster typing. The QWERTY keyboard is the most common modern-day keyboard layout for the Latin script. The name comes from reading the first 6 letters appearing on the top left letter row of the keyboard: QWERT, from left to right. And it has existed since the very first models of typewriters in the final part of the 19th century. There's a reason for that. Back in those times, until the invention of the ball typewriter, the IBM Selectric in 1961. The reason was to avoid keys colliding one against the other and therefore getting stuck, since there are letters in the English language which are used more than others. By the way, you probably know this already. In a sample text of 40,000 words, the letter E appeared 22,000 times, 12%. And the letter T almost 17,000 times, 9%. Therefore, the E key and the T key couldn't be neighbors on the keyboard. The letter E, mind you, is also the most common in the Spanish and French languages. It is not hard to imagine that Scholz's proposal of altering the traditional order of the alphabet would generate resistances among the first users of these pioneering machines. Just imagine what would happen if someone today would suggest altering the orders of the numbers 1 to 9 as a result of a whim or an eccentricity in name of innovation. Indeed, the first Scholz machines weren't very successful commercially. They were expensive, not very practical, heavy, hard to use, and there wasn't a market back then that required them. Many years went by before they stood up as an industry in themselves and became the dominant model for letter writing. They eventually turned into a pivot for the editorial industry and transformed work at home and in the office. They had the advantages of coming, the advantages that came with having a small in-house printing press. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the commercial typewriter became the cogwheel that accelerated the newspaper industry on a global scale, and at the same time, the tool which turned into reality the free speech that strengthened democracy in many countries. The commercial success of the typewriter derived in many electric, much more sophisticated models that help promote cleaner and neater writing. It was this natural evolution on which the computer industry built itself to create devices which served the same purpose and made them available to many people. The most astonishing part of this evolution is that the QWERTY keyboard is still in use, even though its existence is no longer justified technically in the virtual touchscreen keyboards of smartphones and tablets. Such is a subtle difference between the innovation and legacy. Desktop, laptop, and mobile computers are the result of constant and unceasing innovation, which we shall continue to observe in the following years. But Scholz's QWERTY keyboard turned into a legacy, and it refuses to go. We can even find its alteration of the original order of the alphabet in the most recent virtual keyboards projected in form of light on a table, which already exist even if they seem to belong in the realm of science fiction. But above all, the pairing typewriter QWERTY keyboard is a metaphor regarding the way the human race gives a permanence to the useful, like the reinvention of the alphabetical order to write quickly, to extend the margins of experimentation, or the ability to hit the backspace key as many times it seems necessary in order for a text to aspire to perfection. Ed Catmull, founder and president of Pixar and Walt Disney Animation Studios, recently published a book titled Creativity, Inc. In one of its chapters, he reflects on the fear of failure, the very same feeling that causes many to panic in the face of a blank page, or rather the blank screen. Every Pixar movie has been a commercial and artistic success. Some more than others, but they are all nicely finished products, pleasant and visually spectacular. But they weren't at the moment of conception and development, as Catmull explains. In many of them, there were costly errors which implied redoing these projects entirely and the substitution of its directors with high costs in time and money. But this was always done with a conviction to protect new ideas, give them shelter, prevent them from dying before time, and becoming the touching movies some of us are so fond of. Those Pixar mistakes aren't as well known by the general public as was, for instance, the most famous experience of failure turned into success in recent history. Steve Jobs' dismissal from Apple, the company he founded, which made him find refuge in Pixar precisely before his triumphant returning. Catmull, who spent time with Steve Jobs during that period, offers in the mentioned chapter of his book his own perception of failure and the fear this generates in those who try to make a creative contribution. From that same passage, I take a few quotes which summarize the lessons of a company that turned necessity into virtue. I quote, "From a very early age, the message is drilled into your heads. Failure is bad. Failure means you didn't study or prepare. Failure means you slacked off, or worse, aren't smart enough to begin with. Thus, failure is something to be ashamed of." In this context, the author suggests changing our approach on mistakes. I quote again, "Failure isn't a necessary evil. In fact, it isn't an evil at all. Mistakes are an inevitable consequence of doing something new, and as such, should be seen as valuable. Without them, we would have no originality." And he adds, "Creating a fearless culture enables people to explore new areas and pursue ideas with much less hesitation, trepidation, identify uncharted pathways, and then charging down them. It also fosters a greater appreciation and decisiveness, liberating us from the constant preemptive questioning of whether the path we were about to head down is the right one." End of quote. The advice Catmull gives us, and may be applied to different problems which appear in companies, and why not in societies, is that instead of trying to prevent all mistakes, we must assume people have had good intentions and wish to solve problems. Summarizing, hand out responsibilities, do not be intimidated by errors, and find solutions. In Mexico, failure tends to be synonymous to everything, including our national identity. Everything except learning. Although a popular saying of our grandmothers is echando a perder se aprende, making mistakes make you learn, rarely Mexicans talk about our history as a country of a succession of events, some successful and others unfortunate, which lead us to be better. A collective process of learning. An example is our democracy, whose virtues, understandably, many young minds find themselves incapable of assessing because they didn't have to live through the times of authoritarianism in the single-party system our country experienced during 7 decades. One of the privileges of my reporter's life has making me having been able to witness the dissolution of this form of government without checks and balances. It was a system in which voting was a simulation because 1 year before the presidential election, everybody knew who would win the majority of the votes and become president. This was a way of doing politics which made us use the recurring economic crisis without anyone responsible or guilty to pay the price, and that in the end had to be weathered by the solidarity of ordinary people. In some sense, one may qualify the Mexican democratic transition as an act of innovation, and this has undoubtedly to be attributed to organized civic society. During the time the personal computer was being developed in the United States, Mexico experimented an explosion of events which mobilized the society in a peaceful way, not always without human or material costs, yet with a spontaneous transformative calling, which became a benchmark and a point of no return to the paralysis of previous decades. These events not only renovated the framework of the country, they became lessons, changed attitudes, infiltrated the social DNA, and were replicated with a noticeable efficacy. In this city, the nation's capital, the earthquake in 1985, 1 year after my graduation here, mind you, it took the government by surprise. The authorities became petrified by not knowing how to match up with the solidarity shown by people in rescuing victims under the rubble. Almost 30 years after that tragedy, a singular and sometimes unappreciated effort of perseverance in government and civic collaboration has led to a culture of citizen safety and security in the face of natural disasters. For instance, we have been able to carry out, with growing discipline and order, earthquake drills in offices, schools, and public buildings, which have proven very, very useful in the face of tragedies like the one we suffered in 1985. And when the 1980s were coming to an end, internal dissidents appeared in the one-time powerful ruling party. This strengthened the opposition both on the left and the right, and would eventually lead to the end of the monopoly of the PRI on the presidency, which had begun in 1929. An important part of this political evolution was taken away from government's hands, the organization of elections, which today are, despite all the bickering you can hear sometimes, a citizen matter. Ours was a democratic transition full of mistakes, true, but which never became violent and costly in human lives like some in Eastern Europe. We may not allow this legacy to become forgotten, although it is quite natural that many teenagers who have listened to their parents say that democracy doesn't work, that it is a waste of time, or worse, that it is only a mistake, a mechanism which allows a few power brokers and their cronies to become rich thanks to public assets. They are right in many aspects, but we would be mistaken to overlook that, as a society, we have accomplished in this field and what remains to be done. We who lived through difficult times and more than once suffered the last throes of the beast we had to slay are bound to tell our teenagers that it is a virtue that the will of the majority and not the will of a few, which defines our route to become a successful nation instead of a country that is permanently licking its wounds. A fundamental difference between youngsters in the 1980s and those of today is the access of the latter to technology, which not only allows them to carry typing machines in their pockets, but to express ideas anytime they want on social media, which when used in a responsible and creative manner, have become a formidable instrument for free speech and watchdogging. One may object to what is true in a microcosmos should also be true in a country. But we should point out as well that nobody educates us for important things in life. You'll see when you try parenting. At any given time, experimenting is the only option, the only way to avoid paralysis. And we should embrace experimenting without fear. Mexico itself learned to avoid civil wars. It bet for a peaceful transition, even if it took a long and imperfect way. Maybe today we are paying the price of letting some of the branches grow crooked, but life doesn't always end up as we intend. Anyhow, we can always strengthen things. I wish that behind all apparent failures lie the construction of a successful future. The young voters who will go to the ballot box in Mexico this year, more than 3.5 million for the first time, and in 2018, have more than ever the possibility of transforming the instruments of Mexican democracy in a permanent base over which a prosperous and more just country may be built. The country previous generations have wished for and whose mistakes may be turned into success. Writing this brilliant page of history, on a touchscreen of course, may be your legacy. Thank you very much.